All right. Good morning. Thank you so much for joining us here for day 2 of our International Symposium, Colorado State University. My name's Chad. I'm with the Office of International Programs. And our next session here in our symposium today is called Decolonizing Global Health, Perspectives and Applications from the Classroom. And our 2 speakers are Umit Shrestha, an assistant professor in the Colorado School of Public Health, along with Anya Kenyon, a Master of Public Health candidate here at Colorado State University. Before I turn the floor to them, I will ask and remind you to please complete our survey and questionnaire during or at the end of this session. For those in the room, that's what this QR code here is all about. There'll be a link online at the end of the session for folks who are enjoying this session virtually, and we'll also be sending some things by email at the end as well too. So with that, make sure I did everything. I think I did. Take it away, Daniel.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here, taking time out of your schedule to come be with us. Again, my name is Umit Shrestha. I'm an assistant professor in the Colorado School of Public Health here at CSU. And I'm Anna, a Master of Public Health candidate with us today. And our session is titled Decolonizing Global Health, Perspectives and Applications from the Classroom. So let's get started. So before we begin, I do want to acknowledge the land we're on and do a CSU land acknowledgement. Colorado State University acknowledges with respect that the land we are on today is the traditional and ancestral homelands of the Arapaho, Cheyenne, and Ute nations and peoples. This was also a site of trade, gathering, and healing for numerous other native tribes. We recognize the indigenous peoples as original stewards of this land and all the relatives within it. As these words of acknowledgement are spoken and heard, the ties nations have to their traditional homelands are renewed and reaffirmed. CSU is founded as a land-grant institution, and we accept that our mission must encompass access to education and inclusion, and significantly that our founding came at a dire cost to Native nations and peoples whose land this university was built upon. This acknowledgement is the education and inclusion we must practice in recognizing the institutional history, responsibility, and commitment. So as we get started, here is the agenda. Sorry, I'm doing this both. So here's the agenda for today. We have developed 2 different parts. The first part is really discussing the course itself. Since we're focusing on the course that I developed for our program, the first part will cover sort of the development of the course, how it came about, and what it covers. And the second part is the important but also more interesting part of this session that Anna will lead, which is the application of the concepts from the class, right? Where she will take us through the journey of her work in India and explain to us how she applied the concepts she has learned from the class. So that's how we have developed this session for today. Before we get to the meat of the discussion, I do want to quickly talk a little bit about the Colorado School of Public Health here at CSU, because it will allow you all to understand how this course is situated within our program. So for those of you who might not know, Colorado School of Public Health at CSU is a tri-campus model that incorporates University of Colorado Anschutz Medical Campus and University of Northern Colorado in Greeley. We offer a graduate degree, Master's in Public Health. We also have a certificate. And on the right, there is a list of concentrations. Right now, we have epidemiology, global health and health disparities, animals, peoples, and the environment, physical activity and healthy lifestyle, and public health nutrition. And what did I do? I did the wrong one. Okay, there we go. All right, and the course that we will be discussing today, Decolonizing Global Health, is part of our global health and health disparities concentration. So talking a little bit about the course itself, right? The course we are discussing today, Decolonizing Global Health, is one of the required courses within our global health and health disparities concentration. So any students who are in that concentration have to take the course, but it is also open to other students who are interested on the topic. So for example, this semester I have students from language, from biology, from engineering, so who are interested in global health and in the topic at large can also take the course. The course itself is developed through a critical lens, meaning that we want our students to understand, right, this landscape of global health, how it came about, and what are some of the sort of the history of it, and how those historical forces tend to still impact the current being of global health, how it operates, right? So that's the critical lens that I'm talking about. And I want our students to understand that, right? Those colonial legacies that we see in global health currently, and how that contributes to the existing health disparities we see in global health. And for our students to show up as global health professionals in the communities, right? I want our students to understand that, and through that, I want them to build sort of this equitable and just global health system, right? So that's the overall goal of developing this course. So one of the challenges, I think, in discussing the issue of colonialism, when we look at the history of global health, right? Originally, it came about as colonial medicine, which was really there to uphold and enable colonizers to carry out their daily work. What that means is extraction of resources, exploitation of labor, right? So when we use that idea and when we look at the current global health landscape, right, one of the challenges that global health currently experiences is the difficulty in having a uniform definition, right? How do we define global health? I gotta stop pressing that button. Right, and it's open to multiple interpretation. The reason being is that we have multiple stakeholders. If we, and the examples are your funders, policymakers, government of high-income countries, low and middle-income countries, NGOs and INGOs who render services in the field, communities who receive these benefits, right? So depending on who you ask, there tends to be a differing definition of global health. And I continue to see this differences in definition, even when I ask my students in class. That's the first thing we do in our global health class is how do you define global health, right? And with that, right, when we have diverse stakeholders, everybody has competing interests. What that also is remnant of, or what it also shows up as, are the power dynamics, right, in defining global health. So I want you to think about the colonial impact that I just talked about, right? Some of us view it as sort of global health work as going to communities, far off communities, and helping the communities, right? Borderlining the savior perspective. Others, right, depending on where they are, would want to talk about, more so from an equity perspective and that lens. So within that, we see sort of these different power dynamics, right? And we do see this colonial legacy come through. And traditionally, global health has been has taken a very biomedical approach, meaning that it, just showing up to communities and addressing certain disease, whether it's infectious disease or other issues like maternal mortality, but being very singular, right? Not taking this overall factors, other contributing factors that might be impacting these issues. And it tends to have that perspective in defining global health as well, right? So we see that sort of this tension. And where it really becomes an issue is that it has this impact on funding, how we fund global health projects, how are the policies being designed, right? We tend to take either this biomedical approach, right? And that tends to be problematic as well. So just having this definition of global health, a uniform definition of global health, is really challenging and problematic. What I want to direct you all next is the study done by Song, and they looked at between the period of 2009 and 2019 a systematic review of literature, peer-reviewed journal articles, right? And they did qualitative analysis of of how global health was defined. And these were some of their findings, right? That majority of definitions were proposed by health professionals. So now I want you to kind of think about having that definition of global health and the issue it might, if you're just taking it from this biomedical perspective, right? Majority of authors were from high-income countries that, folks who were impacted or the communities where the work being done, often those folks were not accounted in the process of knowledge generation, right? So that is again problematic. Global health tends to be institutionalized faster in high-income countries compared to low and middle-income countries. And what I mean by that, or what they mean by that, is when you think about policies, when you think about programs, when you even think about the courses that are being taught, it tends to be more and quicker, right, in high-income countries than in low and middle-income countries. And one would argue that whether it would be more beneficial, right, for folks from low and middle income countries, students from low and middle income countries, to have greater access to these resources, to have access to this education, right? And lastly, but not least, unevenly reflect the interests and priorities of stakeholders of high income countries, right? So when we look at this current landscape, we do see these colonial legacies come through in the global health landscape that we have right now. Right? The institutionalization of global health, right, in high-income countries reflect these deeper and structural patterns that I mentioned, right, that trace back to the colonial foundations of international health. When we look at how it has come about, we see this sort of systemic issue. And what I mean by that is, if we were to think about colonialism, right, it's quite systematic. That there were formal structures in place to enable for the extraction of resources, for the extraction of labor. And we see typical things happening in global health and in the earlier times, right? That there were efforts by the colonial powers to establish framework for international health organizations. And these efforts were really deeply influenced by colonial agendas which protected the European settlers and their economic interests and really the well-being of the colonized population, right? When we think about the approaches, it was quite intense. It was top-down and coercive approaches at the time. If you think about the how U.S. combated yellow fever in Cuba, right? There was a total disregard for the communal knowledge, the culture, the knowledge of the community. Right? And these tend to be very racialized and paternalistic. We see this in the treatment of indigenous population and how, right, this idea of boarding school comes about and how really extracting individuals from their culture and stripping off them of culture, religion, and really treating them differently, right? So we see that in some instances of how global health has been shaped over the years. I want to quickly talk a little bit about, give you a history of how global health has come about, where it started as colonial medicine between 16th and 20th century. Mid-20th century is when we start seeing sort of this move away from colonial perspective to what we call international health. That's when we start seeing United Nations come about. That's when we start seeing the World Health Organization come about. Really this outward-facing efforts, right, by high-income countries to go to low and middle-income countries, establish, these efforts in global health. And then as we progress from the mid-20th century to the late 20th century, we start seeing sort of this globalized view around, the starting of Millennium Development Goals, global funds for AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria. And now we are right now in the phase of Sustainable Development Goal, where Millennium Development Goals at the time were sort of, again, this outward facing, right, where high-income countries were providing resources and low and middle-income countries were sort of recipients of those aid. But now we see within Sustainable Development Goal a more localized approach. So we are starting to see that change a little bit in that evolution of global health, right?
Is it not working?
No.
Sorry.
Oh, there we go. So Next, I want to talk a little bit about the paper by McCoy here. Sorry. And it talks about how colonialism shows up in global health. And in their discussion within the colonialism and global health, they bring out these different instances of how we see colonialism within global health, colonization of global health, and colonization through global health, right? So first we're talking about when we look at the examples, right? We see this power asymmetry, this unequal relationship, as I talked about earlier, the relationship between high income countries and low and middle income countries, where the funding might flow, right? Where the resources might be made available, but also but also the process of knowledge generation, right? Who gets to produce articles, about the issues, how the agenda are set, right? Who decides on the priorities in global health? So we see that sort of unequal relationship there. And then similarly in global health education, as I mentioned earlier, we do see this structural inequalities, whether it's the case of having resources or to afford these education, having access, visa access to apply to high income countries and get access to those education. So we see a lot of those structural inequalities in global health education as well, right? And then this example comes from Global Health 50/50, and this really showcases the disparity we see in the leadership in global health, right? Where are the most of the organization working in global health are headquartered, mostly in high income countries. When we look at the board members who sit in these nonprofits, they are, they're held by nationals of high income countries. Again, we see quite a bit of disparity when we look at it through the lens of gender, right? So again, this begs this question, like, is global health really global, right? Right now, what we're seeing is it's really not. These folks who are making decisions are they close to the problem? Are they close to the solution? Do they have this lived experience to address, right, through the work they're doing? So again, this is what I'm talking about when I'm talking about power asymmetry. The next I want to talk a little bit about is the colonization of global health, right? That dominance of global health structures by certain actors. I'm talking about your high-income countries, the US, the UK, and other European countries, right? They get to set the agenda and they get to prioritize the issues that fit within their narrative and their cultural ideology. So if you think about the work being done in global health around maternal and child health, a lot of that is dictated through what is deemed right or wrong in high-income countries, right? And wealthy countries and private foundations tend to dominate and control this global health complex through their financial power, right? Of what gets funded, what are the areas that get funded, is largely dictated by these actors, which might not match the reality on the ground, right? There could be a different need on the ground that could not be met. And then the last is colonialism through global health, right? And in reality, global health today, right, can act as a modern form of colonialism where it benefits the powerful actors, whether they are high-income countries or big pharmaceutical companies, right? In reality, it is a trillion-dollar economic sector. And there is some similarity that we can get into, right, around capitalism and colonialism. Both are driven by profit. And we see that again, when we look at global health, the power of big pharmaceutical companies, whether it's vaccine hoarding during the time of COVID, right, or the manipulation of digital health, which is really big right now in global health, but controlled by few big tech companies, right? So when we put this all together, right, where do we situate this lens of decolonizing global health? What are we teaching our students in classroom, right? Is to really understand these legacies and these structures in place. And if we are to allow our students to go in the field, I want them to have the tools to understand these structures in place. How do we work with the local communities to create solutions, to co-create solutions with them, right? How do we promote locally led health solutions if we're thinking about it in terms of sustainability of efforts in global health, and really allow our students to rethink this power dynamic that exists in global health system. And that's where I bring in, right? This is what we are training our global health students through. And within this course, they get to explore the historical account of global health, right? Within that, they look into geopolitics, capitalism, because they are a big part of global health. Global health does not happen in a vacuum. It does not operate in a vacuum, that there are different factors. There's a lot of push and pull, and we're seeing that right now, right? With how the landscape is being handled. And how do we allow our students to utilize the concept that I've just mentioned to frame their work through that lens, right? Celebrating successes in low and middle income countries. We can tie this to the earlier point about those locally led solutions. How do we allow our students to be in that space to celebrate those successes? And then also identify that there are going to be challenges and inequities on the ground, right? That I don't want our students, when they go out in the field of global health, to view low and middle income countries as this one giant monolithic structure, that there are intersectionalities within each community that they are well equipped to address, right? And then the last but not least, giving up power, that when you show up to communities that you want to work with, how do you navigate that landscape? And as an outsider, how do you give power to those communities and really be ally and co-create solutions for them that is sustainable? And this is the last slide that I want to leave you all with as I pass it to Anna. This comes from Dr. Madhu Pai, who is the chair of Global Public Health at McGill University in Canada. This is a play on the old blind monk and elephant proverb, where an elephant is brought to a village through a circus, and monks are really interested in learning more about the elephant. So they'll go and touch the elephant, right? But every monk is touching a different part of that elephant. And when they're later asked to describe an elephant, they are only talking about the part they touched, right? So when we think about power and privilege or this colonial impact in global health, right? See it as this elephant in the room. It has so many different parts, and we have to be addressing these different factors and not just a part of it, right? As a whole. And that's what I want you all to take away from this presentation. But this is also something that we discuss at large in our course in Decolonizing Global Health. I'm going to pause and pass it on to Anna, and then we'll have some time for Q&A for discussion.
Cool. Thanks, Umit. So for the next part of the lecture, I'll be talking about applying the decolonization approach to the global health project that I am a part of, which is called the East India Hockey Project. And it is a gender-based violence and human trafficking prevention program in Jharkhand, India, which you can see on the right here. So just a quick about me and my background in the project. So in 2018, I began working on it. And in 2022, I moved to India to deepen my understanding of the local context, the cultural norms, the languages, and to strengthen local partnerships. And after that, I returned to the US to attend grad school here and build a knowledge base about power asymmetry and best practices in working in global health. So I just wanted to visualize the human trafficking pathways that we see in Jharkhand. In Jharkhand, trafficking agencies tend to exploit low-income, rural, or lower caste communities by offering too good to be true job opportunities that occur in other cities and states. Often, trafficked individuals are unpaid, unable to contact their families, and forced into unwanted sexual arrangements. It's important to note here that human trafficking is widely underreported globally, including in India, for reasons including but not limited to stigma and shame among survivors, lack of information and access to systems of reporting, lack of trust in law enforcement, and police, and data suppression by state and federal governments so as to not highlight that this is an issue in their states. So the East India Hockey Project was designed within this context. And the central aim of the project is to reduce human trafficking, child marriage, and gender-based violence through education, women's empowerment, and cultural exchange. And the program uses sports as a tool for social change, which is a central project of the U.S. Department of State's Sports Diplomacy Division. And you might be wondering why hockey? And first of all, field hockey is the national sport of India. So it's just as popular as cricket, and it's especially popular in Jharkhand. And further, an emerging best practice in global public health and public health prevention programs in the United States is to utilize strengths-based and culturally grounded methods. And so for us, hockey is a useful tool to strengthen individual and collective empowerment, engage youth in culturally appropriate and acceptable ways, and to provide safe spaces for sharing and connecting about difficult topics and having vulnerable conversations. So this program does have strong local partnerships, and it was grounded in local concerns, but it's important to highlight that the funding sources of this program were external. So this gets at what Umit was talking about. The program was developed by the US State Department, and they put out a notice of funding opportunity in 2017. And the grant was initially awarded to an Indian NGO, Shakti Vihini, that focuses on women and girls' rights in India. They conduct trafficking raids, law, litigation, and programming. And Shakti Vihini then contracted Middlebury College, which is my alma mater. And we were additionally supported by the US Sports Diplomacy Sports Envoy Program. So again, this is a division of the Department of State that mobilizes utility of sport in improving lives, transforming societies, and especially in underserved communities. So importantly, with the funding, after 2 years, the consulate in Kolkata and the US Department of State asked Middlebury to apply for the next round of grant funding with Shakti Vihini as the subawardee. So this meant that myself and Middlebury were now managing the grant, and Shakti Vihini was the implementation partner. So that starts to get at some of the patterns that we see in global health and who gets power and why. The other important thing that I want to note here is that above all else, the US State Department and the consulate and the sports diplomacy programs are international diplomacy entities. They're not public health organizations. And so while there are amazing people involved with programs that benefit public health, the consular and government priorities really are international diplomacy, and they're pretty PR focused. So that was a constant factor that our team was trying to kind of hold in balance to satisfy funding and stakeholders and government officials in India and in the US, but also to be working all the time for the girls themselves and for the local partners that we had there. And real quick, I think this just summarizes the kind of timeline of the program from when it started to today. So on the left, you can see the beginning, the first NOFO, then the transition to Middlebury and myself managing the grant, then my return to school, and then the third program where we started incorporating and applying a decolonizing lens. And then here at the end, which will be the focus of the later part of this discussion, will be the evaluation and the independent study I conducted last semester to kind of address and apply this decolonization lens. And before I go into critiquing and applying the decolonizing lens and some of the decolonizing methodologies that we incorporated to the program, I just wanted to kind of stop and mention that I came back here to school to learn under UMIT and to reflect on my positionality in global health. And in my time here, I've had that opportunity to reflect on my role in oppressive and neocolonial systems that are laden with power asymmetries. And at the same time, to learn how to hold space for processes to unfold, to understand that it takes time to improve programs at the small scale and to change global health at the large scale and to decolonize. And so UMIT's guidance has been a reminder to think critically, but to recognize that we have to start somewhere. It doesn't all need to be solved or figured out just yet. And that's allowed me to engage more deeply instead of, I think, pulling away from those feelings of shame and guilt when you start to really think critically about the work that you're doing. And then another kind of key takeaway personally of both living and working in India is to stop thinking critically sometimes and just enjoy being with people, working with people. Like these programs are fun. We're playing sports with kids. And ultimately, I really believe that working across cultures is not only allowed, but essential. And that while there are challenges in doing that, there's ongoing value in building solid relationships with people whose experiences are different than our own. And I think we have a lot of sensitivity around doing that in the US. And in my personal reflections, I continue to feel that that's really important and it's okay. So now I'll highlight a few critiques of the program that I've developed over the past couple of years. So first, as Umit pointed out, external funding in global health both reveals and perpetuates neocolonial power asymmetries and reliance on high-income countries. And it therefore reinforces the power and influence of foreign entities and their cultural and political ideologies, and increases reliance on foreign aid instead of promoting local capacity building. So for this program, it's funded by the US government and it's therefore an expression of our priorities, even if it's in partnership with local entities. And like I mentioned earlier, an early strength of the program was the fact that it was originally managed by Shakti Vihini, an Indian-based NGO, with deep local partnerships and a profound understanding of the local culture. And so I think when the Department of State asked us to flip the grant leadership, Middlebury, which is kind of just me, became the entity with the power to make decisions, approve budgets, and plan program activities. And I think that that really impacted the structure of the program and some of the potentials for success when we think about it through a decolonizing lens. And it has the potential to perpetuate white supremacy while minimizing key strengths and centrality of Indian staff who are responsible for making the program successful. Further, if we think about continuity of the program, when the grant was provided to Middlebury and also just the holding of the grant by the US State Department, that puts the program at risk due to the power asymmetry embedded in the structure, because ultimately the US government could determine whether the program would continue, and local groups don't have that final say, and I'll get to that more later in the conversation. And additionally, throughout the year, if we think about just annual continuity, I relied on partners providing on-the-ground support. There wasn't a full-time staff in India managing the program or embedded within the community. And even Shakti Vihini, they were based out of Jharkhand and they were based out of Delhi and they traveled to Jharkhand a lot, but they weren't in these remote villages. So finally, I'll just touch on local capacity. So by contracting a US partner, I think the program missed a valuable opportunity to build capacity and train local leaders on the principles of human trafficking and gender-based violence prevention. And those local leaders would have had their own expertise and lived experience that they could bring to the table and probably ultimately do a better job than someone like me who comes in without that lived experience, that on the ground knowledge of how the local societies operate. So this perpetuates a dynamic where high income countries are stepping in thinking that maybe we have some knowledge to offer or some resources, and we're administering programs in low and middle income countries, rather than providing resources and training for local leaders to run the programs themselves. Monitoring and evaluation is the fourth component, and I'm going to spend a lot of time on that later in the presentation, so I'll skip it for now. So I just provided a critique using the decolonizing lens, and now I'll show kind of what we did once that critique was made. How did we apply an approach to address some of those concerns? So we began to intentionally weave some strategies into the program. So first, we provided decolonization trainings for program leaders. So similar to what Umit was just sharing you, and with plenty of articles and homework, basically to unpack what is globalization and localization in public health. What is it like? What does it mean to work cross-culturally and to center the voices of our stakeholders and program participants and partners in India? And then next, we added capacity building components to the program. So we added coaching, umpiring or reffing, and mentorship programs to build local capacity and leadership. So one of my favorite examples of this was we invited alumni from previous programs to come back and to coach the camp, and we compensated them for their time. So essentially they just became employees of the program. We also worked with really bolstering partnership development, and that's one of the reasons that I ended up spending more time in India and living over there, was to deepen some of those relationships. And one of the ways that looked for this program in particular was actually increasing partnerships with local police and law enforcement. So traditionally, human trafficking is really addressed through law enforcement and litigation, and the public health approach to human trafficking prevention is pretty new, maybe in the past like a decade or two. And so we worked with the local police to provide year-round opportunities for the girls to play field hockey. They provided transportation to fields, and they also provided oversight, because unfortunately sports fields are actually a site for human trafficking, and multiple girls that I've worked with have at times been trafficked from the field hockey field. So it's a really complex issue there, and ensuring that can happen safely was a big priority for us. Yeah, I could go on about that. I'll keep going. So this gets to the kind of focus that I've taken on the program, and that is a formal program evaluation. So to clarify, the Department of State grants do require monitoring and evaluation, but after a couple of years, I ended up feeling uncomfortable with the aspects of how the program was measured and evaluated, and those requirements. So examples of the M&E framework, M&E stands for monitoring and evaluation, required were factors like number of participants reached, number of partnership meetings conducted, number of anti-trafficking campaigns initiated. And all of these might be useful indicators, but they don't really measure participant experiences and learnings at the program. And for me, the biggest concern actually was they don't measure risks that the participants might be taking on by coming to the program. So my goal with developing this evaluation, which I did in partnership with the Center for Epidemiological and Program Evaluation group at Anschutz, was to center the girls' experiences themselves. So what are they learning from the program? Were they taking on risks by attending the program? Did they care more about the field hockey or what they were learning about gender issues, norms, and trafficking? And on a basic level, like, who are these girls and why are they here? Why do they want to be here? Who supported them coming? They're coming in from really remote districts of Jharkhand, and like 5-6 hour drives and staying for a week far from their families, which is highly unusual for a girl of their background and socioeconomic status. So like, what got them here was a big question. So we focused on 3 research questions for the evaluation. One was, do participants report improved feelings of self-efficacy or self-esteem after the program? The second was, do they report changes in knowledge, attitudes, or perceptions of human trafficking, child marriage, and gender-based violence after the program? And the third was, do they report changes in their aspirations and their attitudes about aspirations in relation to gender after the program? So I chose a convergent mixed methods design, and this involves the simultaneous and independent collection and analysis of both quantitative information and qualitative information. So you have these two strands of data, and then you converge them and analyze the intersection of the two strands. And the theory behind convergent mixed methods design is that by comparing and mixing these two types of data, the evaluation team can gain a deeper understanding of participants' experiences than either data strand would allow for in isolation. So I chose this design for a couple of reasons. The first was timing. There are other forms of mixed methods design that are explanatory or exploratory sequential designs, but that requires more time than we had. So an example of that would be administering surveys, analyzing the data, and then conducting focus groups. And based on the length of this program, that was not going to be possible. The programs are about a week long, and the participants don't live at all near the program. So we needed to collect all of our data on site. The second major reason was about loss to follow-up. So our positionality and the circumstances of the girls in these remote districts where it's not really appropriate for me to enter as a researcher prevented me from conducting research in the communities themselves. And the districts are quite insular, and there are also risk factors associated with naxalism in these specific regions, which actually prevent folks with US government funding, from going in without special permissions. This is a really good example of how doing this work as a foreigner is really limiting, and that if I were a local researcher, my ability to explore a more flexible study design would be improved. I could host focus groups in each district. There would be a greater sense of belonging and appropriateness for me to be in those settings. I could set up interviews with stakeholders that I got to know over time. So again, another problematic aspect of being a white woman in Colorado trying to do research in remote regions of India. So the mixed methods design had two aspects. We had surveys and focus group interviews. So the surveys had Likert scale type questions and responses, and we relied on externally validated instruments that we modified for the program. But all of these instruments were validated in India, Bangladesh, and Nepal. And so that helped us understand that they were more likely to be locally appropriate. And then the focus group questions were designed specifically to probe components of this program. So they were not derived from validated instruments, although they were modeled off best practices. So surveys were about 10 to 12 minutes to prevent fatigue from survey respondents, and they were administered on arrival for baseline and at the end of the program. And for focus group interviews, the goal was to administer about 8 to 10 conversations with about 3 girls present in each interview. And the primary interviewer, myself, would remain the same while the interpreters would change. And that builds in both consistency, but also mitigates bias by changing who the interpreter is. The reason to have 3 girls there was just to create a safer space of dialogue. I've administered qualitative interviews in India and at this program in the past, one-on-one, and I think that sometimes it was hard for the girls to just settle into the conversation, and there were feelings of kind of tenseness, and so that was one of the reasons for bringing in, allowing them to bring in friends. Then after the surveys and focus groups would be conducted, the data would be merged to understand how the quantitative and qualitative data reinforced or diverged from one another. So if I give as a quick example of how this might look in practice, one thing that we measured were aspirations of the girls. So we asked 2 questions in the interviews or in the surveys. One is, what is the highest level of education you would like to complete if finances and opportunities are available? And the girls would select from a list of education levels in India. And then the next is, have you ever discussed your education goals with your parent or adult relative? And the girls could select yes or no. So then we would have that data across all participants of the program, but we could ask in focus groups, do you know anyone who had to stop school because their parents wanted them to focus on work or get married? Can you describe the situation to me? What did you think of it? Can you describe how your community reacted to it? How did your teachers react to it? In your opinion, is this more likely to happen to girls or boys? Why do you think that is? So those conversations allow us to understand in a much more rich way what we're able to develop and quantify with those more specific survey questions. So here are the core characteristics that we dug into with the evaluation, and this was informed by the literature. So the program was designed to promote women's empowerment, but in my literature review, I learned that it's difficult to measure empowerment, and it's more effective to measure components of empowerment. So that's why we landed on these indicators. So for something like aspirations, we collected information about goal setting, future orientation about work, education, family planning, or athletic goals. And I should mention that there's quite a bit of evidence that girls who stay in school longer are less likely to be trafficked or to become child brides. So that's why there's a lot of focus on education in the program. Then for self-efficacy, we looked at individual self-efficacy. So thinking about self-satisfaction, confidence, and parental support, as well as collective self-efficacy. So do the girls feel that them and their community members could prevent gender violence? Could they come together to expand girls' rights? And both of these indicators allowed us to measure whether the girls felt like their self-efficacy or their social capacity would allow them to challenge and change norms. Then we looked at agency and negotiation factors. So these include comfort, like voicing your opinion to your peers or your parents, and making decisions about your future. So whether girls wanted to stay in school or pursue a career is only impactful if they're empowered to voice these desires and to negotiate with their families about them. So it does matter what they want, but it also matters whether or not they're able to voice what they want. So we wanted to make sure that we weren't just changing their goals, but that we were understanding whether or not they were empowered to voice those goals, and that they believed that they had the self-efficacy to actually act on them. The locus of control, that probed topics like perceived ability for girls to choose on their own when to marry. So similar to what I just mentioned, but a slightly different indicator. And then social norms was really broad, and it covers quite a breadth of topics, but it definitely included perceived community opinions on girls' education, and particularly studying both before and after marriage. So in total, we were incorporating evidence-based instruments that would allow us to measure changes in each of these domains and provide data on whether the program was achieving its stated goals. So we were looking like, is this program actually empowering girls? And we're asking that question through these indicators. And the baseline and inline characteristics were really there to help us understand what aspects of identity might be mediating the other variables that we measured. So we're looking at their age, their district, like where they're from, their level of schooling, their religion, their caste, and their program expectations. And then we can ask questions like, does a girl's district influence her ideas about gender roles? And does her age influence her career aspirations or perceived power to negotiate with her family? And then at the end of the program, we also asked questions that we felt were really important, which was, did girls feel safe to tell their peers, their family, and their communities about what they had learned at the program? Because ultimately the program design would need to be reconsidered if the knowledge that was gained at this program wasn't safe to share outside of the context that we had created. So, unfortunately, the funding for this program was cut last week, but I made the slides before that happened, and rather than changing them, I thought it would still be useful to discuss what the next steps would have been for the evaluation. So to ensure that the survey and focus group questions were appropriate within a local context, we would next be holding conversations with our local partners in India, including educators, health officials, members of the team at Shakti Vihini, members of the local police divisions that we partner with. And in the process, they'd be able to guide us on questions that weren't culturally appropriate, might be highly sensitive and that the girls wouldn't want to answer, or just wouldn't translate well into Hindi or local dialects. While all of the questions that I incorporated were from pre-validated instruments in India, Nepal, and Bangladesh, we really would need to rely on our partners to understand feasibility and acceptability of this evaluation. And then after that, we go through translation and check again with partners like, how's this looking? Have the questions retained their original meaning? Are they still appropriate? And then finally, we would pilot the evaluation at the next program, which was slated for fall of 2025, and then analyze the results, stakeholder feedback, and iterate on it for future programs. So that was a lot, but the current context and the takeaways that I want you all to have from what I shared are the importance of local capacity building, local funding, and local partnerships in global health, and the importance of evidence basis for programming government and public health, which is really why I wanted to bring in that monitoring and evaluation piece. And then that piece that I touched on, which is recognizing that we can work towards the ideal without halting meaningful work altogether. So just because we're able to make quite a few critiques about a program doesn't mean that there's not value in that program, and doesn't mean that we can't ultimately transition it into a more sustainable model. And then the other piece is instability and change that's inherent in global health. And honestly, the fact that the program was defunded is the ultimate kind of like call for decolonization. It's an example of the fact that when programs and communities and countries are dependent on external funding from folks like us in the US, that's a really tenuous relationship. And ultimately, that probably doesn't best serve the communities. And that's not to say that there's not complex dynamics on the ground in India, and we've seen plenty of internal national challenges as well, which is another big piece of global health, right? Like there might be civil unrest, there might be changes in government at the local level abroad as well. But really, the takeaway for me is that ultimately, as much as possible, if we can design global health programs that are rooted in, managed by, and funded through local institutions, we're going to have more success and sustainability in the field.
And as Emma pointed out, and I want to move to our final slide, which to do some Q&A, but really be mindful about when we think about decolonizing global health, and we think about this idea, right, that we have to be intentional, and there are structures in place that we have to be really mindful about addressing those in the work we do. So even in Anna's work about, selecting instruments, right, you have to be mindful about getting at those information. So I want to leave you all with that and then move to our Slido. So if you have any thoughts or questions, well, they should have gone on to a QR code and be able to ask questions or something that you could have shared. But I want to open up for questions if you all have any thoughts, suggestions, ideas for us, and we could spend the next 5 minutes on this.
I'll ask one, probably partially formulated in my mind, but thank you for your presentation. I think it's just such an important topic and like so timely, and I love your last comment about, you know, what's happening as kind of the ultimate call for just like really thinking hard about these questions, right? I think I think my question is actually a little bit kind of on your program, because I think when you think about these issues and you think about decolonizing and like the issue of, you know, access to higher education and degrees in public health, like are there some ways that, you know, internally you're having that conversation in terms of like structural access and kind of engagement in the higher ed space?
Yeah, right. Within our program, we are having those conversations, but one of the things that is really sometimes out of our control and, you know, at a macro level are issues around visas, right? Even though we have students who have access to this and would, you know, and there would be instances where we provided some scholarship to folks from countries outside of the US, they would still not get the visa. And that's the part that we are really struggling about. How can we go about addressing that, right? If we are, you know, just having limited access, right? So even if you think about the program or any of the conferences in global health are typically in high income countries. So that systematically excludes a lot of folks, right? So yes, we're having that conversation, but also sometimes some of these macro level forces are out of our control, and at times it can get frustrating.
And one of the topics we cover in the course is the fact that journals and the vast majority of MPH programs are all based in high income countries. And so instead of thinking just like, how do we get more people here to CSU, it's like, how do we build MPH programs elsewhere? Actually, how do they build MPH programs elsewhere? And it's hard to constantly restructure those questions of like really thinking locally, globally.
And we have a question from online, from Kath Herbert asking, does mentoring pose a risk in terms of further imposing a colonial view? Was this viewed as a two-way process of mentoring, i.e. both learning from each other rather than a top-down approach?
Yeah, totally. Everything poses a risk. It's really tricky, right? And I think that is the exciting part of working cross-culturally, is constantly navigating that dynamic of power and making, trying to address that in real time in a super relational way to show people that like you really value their voice and their expertise and you see them as experts and leaders, and allowing them to like develop that and cultivate that for themselves. So like one aspect of mentoring could be like, you know, going through say like a goal setting exercise with girls and, you know, demonstrating like, all right, here's how we set goals. And now like you go ahead and do that, conduct that exercise with yourselves, with your small groups, and then talk about that with each other. So that's really about them and their worlds. And we're trying to more facilitate a space for them to relate to one another. And then the other thing is that we work with so many Indian women on site at the program. So letting them really manage. And honestly, one of the beautiful aspects of the fact that we're not all fluent in Hindi is that we're relying on interpreters who get to bring like their own leadership and their own style and messaging. And they don't just stand there and say what we say, like they totally deliver a message that belongs to them. And so I think in that way, they're also acting as a mediating force, but it requires a lot of self-reflection to not just put your kind of like thoughts and agendas on other people, especially with women's health, because I could do a whole different presentation on the differences between how we think and talk about things like menstruation and marriage and sexual health here compared to what we're talking about in communities there. So That's a good question that I could barely even scratch the surface of right now.
Well, we're at the top of the hour. Thank you all for joining us here in person online. Thank you for filling out the survey, either the QR code or you'll get it online through email. And please join me in thanking our presenters today, Lynn and Anna, for sharing all their information. Session starts in an hour.